everyone, this is the second part of my two-part sequence on aggregate supply and aggregate demand. This video will discuss how we can use the ASAD model to explain three important time periods in U.S. economic history. How fiscal policy was implemented to get us out of the Great Depression in the 1930s, how contractionary monetary policy was a response to stagflation in the 1970s, and how expansionary monetary policy resolved the Great Recession in the late 2000s. Ben Bernanke was the chair of the Fed during the Great Recession. He's arguably the most prominent scholar on the Great Depression. Bernanke and others have argued that the Great Depression during the 1930s was triggered by a decrease in aggregate demand. First, there was a period of contractionary monetary policy. The thinking here was that higher interest rates would reduce speculation in the stock market. The hope was that investors would park more of their money in safer bonds and savings accounts in lieu of the stock market. Well, as we learned in the previous chapter, these higher interest rates will stifle consumption, leading to lower GDP. So an unintended consequence of contractionary monetary policy is that industries sensitive to the interest rate, like construction or the manufacturing of durable goods, such as appliances and cars, suffered from a lack of spending by consumers and businesses. Finally, the stock market crash in October 1929 was the last straw that led to a further collapse in spending by households and companies and ultimately caused the Great Depression, which lasted about a decade. So how did fiscal policy help us get out of the Great Depression? First off, ignore the two blue AD curves on this graph momentarily. If you just look at the black curves, we have an initial aggregate demand curve, AD0, that intersects the horizontal portion of the short-run aggregate supply, or SAS curve, since GDP was so low during the Great Depression that an increase in production can occur without the need to increase prices due to higher labor costs. Also notice the vertical long-run aggregate supply, or LAS curve, that depicts the optimal amount of GDP. Recall that fiscal policy is an aggregate demand shifter, such that an increase in government spending would cause the aggregate demand curve to shift to the right. Well, President Roosevelt engaged in Keynesian economics by increasing the size of the federal government substantially with his New Deal. This is when Social Security and unemployment benefits were first introduced, as well as a lot of public infrastructure works. So in general, John Maynard Keynes argued that the government can spend its way out of a depression, which is what is depicted in the graph as shifts from AD0 to AD1 to AD2. In fact, academic scholars argue that it took all of the military spending associated with World War II to get us out of the Great Depression and into the upward sloping portion of the short-run aggregate supply curve. The second time period that we want to study is the 1970s, during which the U.S. economy experienced stagflation, which is a combination of inflation, or higher prices, and stagnation, or lower GDP. Academic scholars argue that this was a result of an oil embargo with OPEC that led to a dramatic increase in the price of oil. This created a huge shortage of gas, such that cars were restricted to get gas on certain days of the week, depending on whether their license plate ended in an even or odd number. In this graph, you can see that stagflation was caused by an increase in the price of oil and gas, an input for many products. So the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the left from SAS1 to SAS2. Notice that this leads to an increase in the price level, or inflation, and a decrease in GDP, or stagnation. Paul Volcker became the chair of the Fed in 1979, while the U.S. economy was struggling with this stagflation problem. His strategy was to engage in contractionary monetary policy, which would increase the interest rate in an attempt to slow spending so that the aggregate demand curve would shift to the left. This would lower the price level and hopefully stabilize inflation. So this story has a happy ending, right? Wrong. Notice contractionary monetary policy also leads to lower GDP, and so Paul Volcker ushers the country into not one, but two recessions during his time as Fed chair. Notice that interest rates, represented by the green line, increase in 1979 as Volcker steps in as the Fed chair, which does in fact cause inflation, represented by the red line, to start to decrease from an astronomical 12.5%. But, and this is a big but, unemployment, which is represented by the blue line, also starts to rise, and the Fed graph shows the recessions from January 1980 to July 1980, and then again from July 1981 to November 1982. It's easy to play Monday morning quarterback and criticize Volcker's monetary policy strategy in hindsight, but we hopefully can at least appreciate the motivation behind his decision. This takes us to the third and final time period that we will study, which is the Great Recession from December 2007 to June 2009. The textbook came up with the following list of economic factors that were in play as we were heading into the Great Recession, but I wanted to verify that these items were legit, so I went to the website for the St. Louis Fed to create graphs using variables in Fred database. Here we have a variable called Real Net Fixed Investment Residential, which is a proxy for the value of home prices. Notice that the Great Recession is illustrated by the gray vertical bar furthest to the right. I kept the entire time series just so that you can get an idea of the overall trend, but we can notice a steep decline in home values if we focus on the value right before the gray bar for the Great Recession, which is consistent with the book's claim that housing prices and wealth decreased during this time period. As far as expansionary monetary policy is concerned, we could take a look at the value of M1 and the interest rate. Notice that the blue line, which is money supply, is increasing dramatically during the Great Recession, while at the same time, the red line, which is the interest rate, is decreasing. Both of these are consistent with the ramifications of expansionary monetary policy. Recall the list of economic factors from the textbook. The first four all serve to decrease aggregate demand. Recall that aggregate demand is based on GDP, which consists of consumer spending, C, business investment, I, government spending, G, and net exports, X minus M. A decrease in home prices and consumer wealth lowers C, the consumer spending portion of GDP. Decreased consumer and business confidence, as well as a credit crisis in financial markets, weaken both C and I. Finally, slower rate of growth in federal government spending decreases G. Not everything was bleak and negative at that time, though. We had a continuous increase in money supply to lower interest rates, which would prop up C and I. The decrease in the value of the dollar makes American products relatively cheaper compared to foreign products, which increases net exports, as does the growth in foreign countries. So we have some factors that decrease aggregate demand, while other changes improve aggregate demand. The net effect depends on which side dominates. Spoiler alert, the AD curve will ultimately shift to the left due to an overall decrease in aggregate demand. As far as aggregate supply is concerned, the textbook claims that the short-run aggregate supply curve shifted to the left due to higher labor costs and energy costs. However, the long-run aggregate supply curve shifted to the right due to improvements to productivity. This means that actual production decreased due to higher input costs, but the potential for the economy actually increased, so the optimal amount of GDP increased. Again, I wanted to verify the book's claim, so I created a couple more graphs using the Fred database. Here we have a time series for the wages and salaries of private industry workers, which is similar to the way the Bureau of Labor Statistics calculates the monthly unemployment rate. Notice how this index is increasing leading up to and throughout the Great Recession, so the textbook is correct when it listed an increase in unemployment costs leading to a decrease in short-run aggregate supply. According to my macroeconomic friends, the best variable to proxy for productivity is total labor productivity, which is based on how much output is produced for a given number of workers. As we can see here, the blue line is increasing leading into and during the Great Recession, so the textbook is correct when it listed an increase in productivity leading to an increase in long-run aggregate supply. So what should we expect the aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph to look like? Recall that the y-axis of the ASAD graph is the price level, in which an increase in the price level implies inflation, whereas a decrease in the price level implies deflation. Here we can see that the blue line representing inflation is positive, but close to zero. So we should anticipate a very small increase in the price level in the ASAD graph. We can also see that real GDP is decreasing during the Great Recession, so we should anticipate a lower GDP value along the x-axis of the ASAD graph. So here we have the ASAD graph for the Great Recession. The black lines are the curves for 2007, which represent the time period before the Great Recession, while the blue lines are the curves for 2008, which represent the time period during the Great Recession. Recall that we had a list of factors that increased aggregate demand and a list of factors that decreased aggregate demand. Overall, the effect is net negative, so the AD 2007 curve shifts to the left to become the AD 2008 curve. As far as aggregate supply is concerned, remember that the textbook claimed, and we verified, that short-run aggregate supply decreases, but long-run aggregate supply actually increases during the Great Recession. So here we have that the SAS 2007 curve shifts to the left to become the SAS 2008 curve, whereas the LAS 2007 curve shifts to the right to become the LAS 2008 curve. Notice on the y-axis that the price level went up between 2007 and 2008 by a small amount, which is consistent with the data suggesting weak but positive inflation. We can also see along the x-axis that Y 2007 decreases to Y 2008, which suggests that GDP decreased. What I find really interesting about supply and demand back in Chapter 2 is that we can use the traditional graph to explain microeconomic price changes, but we can also use the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model to explain macroeconomic business cycles. Now that you're done with the two-part sequence, I encourage you to review the practice problems that are provided on Moodle to make sure that you fully understand the concepts introduced in these recordings. Remember that I also provide the solutions to these ungraded problems, and that the purpose of these exercises is to give you an idea of the types of questions you might see on the final exam. As always, feel free to email me with any questions that you have.